Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and here I am in front of the statue of Robert Clive, or Clive of India as he's popularly known, Lord Clive of Plassey. I ought to give him his naval title. So today is the day of Plassey, his most resounding victory, the 23rd of June, 1757, which is fought in the Bengal. Well, what were the events leading up to that? The 7 Years' War was going on in Europe, but it spread to other continents, to the American continent as well as to Asia. The French Compagnie des Indes Orientales was very active there, as well as the Honourable East India Company, and they clashed, and both the British and the French had their client Indian rulers. Anyway, Siraj-ud-Dowlah was the Nawab of Bengal. Bengal's a province of India. Nawab is a title a bit like king. He objected to the French and the British extending their fortifications. Now, did he have legal grounds to prevent the British from doing this? I'm not sure. He might have done. Now, the East India Company had purchased Calcutta in absolute sovereignty some years before. It had been a village by the river Hooghly when Job Charnock founded it after he married a Hindu widow, talked her out of sati, as in ritual suicide in her husband's funeral pyre. The capital of Bengal at the time was Murshidabad. Anyway, the British carried on regardless, extended their fortifications, so did the French. So Siraj-ud-Dowlah went to war against the East India Company. They're not against the United Kingdom itself. It's a curious anomaly, that. Another thing I should point out, this was such a splendid victory because it was on the British side. There were how many men? There was something like 6,000 against about 60,000 on the other side. Well, there's a small fact that I must acknowledge. This was won largely because Mir Jafar, who's Siraj-ud-Dowlah's commander, deserted with half his troops. So this battle was won by gold more than blood. He was offered douceur, and that's the way it worked. Now, one mustn't be too chauvinistic. I'm not closed-minded about this, and I realised that both sides were amoral. People fight for resources and ideology. This was chiefly a resources-driven conflict. Anyway, Siraj-ud-Dowlah was defeated. He fled in disguise. He was later tracked down and killed by Mir Jafar's son. Mir Jafar became Nawab of Bengal, as recognised by the East India Company. However, he fell out with the British a couple of years later, was replaced by someone they found more amenable. So that's that. So Robert Clive, he'd won many other victories at the Battle of Arcot and so on. So he started off as a clerk in the Honourable East India Company, but he was most distinguished as an audacious military commander, and so this statue of him was put up. So every schoolboy was told to exalt him for decades, and that only ended in about the 1960s. He's scarcely mentioned in textbooks these days. Plassey came sometime after Calcutta was seized by Siraj-ud-Dowlah. The city is now known as Kolkata, and there was a notorious Black Hole of Calcutta incident when, I think it's 146 British prisoners were put into a cell designed for 6, and most of them died of asphyxia. However, some doubt is cast and that the numbers are probably exaggerated. There's no doubt that some sort of incident occurred. This was probably cock-up more than conspiracy. And there was a similar thing happened about a century later with the British Raj, with putting prisoners into like a railway carriage without sufficient ventilation. And it was just negligence, and many of them died as a result. So there was a plaque on the wall of Fort George for well over a century commemorating this, and British have said, oh, it's an example of just how barbaric Siraj-ud-Dowlah was, and we had to emancipate the Indian people from their monstrous rulers. When Subhas Chandra Bose was mayor of Calcutta in the late 1930s, Bose had that plaque removed, which he felt was imperialist propaganda. Anyway, these buildings hard by, this one's the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and that one is Her Majesty's Treasury. Now, one of these, a bit of one of these, used to be the India Office until 1947. The illustrations around the back of him in the mango tope the night before the Battle of Plassey, which is actually a British mispronunciation of Palashi, another one about lifting the siege of Arcot, and so on, and many other magnificent military feats. So that is Clive, and he was so honoured that Clive became a popular Christian name for boys for well over a century after Robert Clive died. So when he came back to the United Kingdom, was elected to Parliament, he was quizzed by a parliamentary commission about his conduct in India, was entirely ethical and so forth. So people then were primarily actuated by booty, not duty. I think that they would have been open about that. That's not to say it was completely bad for the Indian people, or that the Indian rulers were much better. I suppose I'm advancing a tu quoque argument, and you might say that the East India Company was exploitative in India, and there would be some merit to that claim. However, British companies and the government in the United Kingdom were little better. So I don't think there's a racial difference there. And indeed, there was no sense of racial superiority in India in the 18th century. It's only later some people began to feel like that. So that's enough on the day of Plassey.